The game is over. In just 48 hours, the Western world launched an unprecedented, coordinated and ruthless final siege operation designed to bring down Vladimir Putin's regime, which has been in place for over 20 years. This is not speculation, it is a chilling reflection of the stark realities on the ground. The curtain rose on October 15, 2025, simultaneously on two different stages, both of which were nightmare scenarios for the Kremlin. But the seeds of this nightmare had been sown weeks, even months earlier. The voice from Washington was not a warning, but a final ultimatum. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stepped in front of the cameras and uttered the words that froze Moscow's blood. The time has come to end the war. Following its decision to invade Ukraine, Russia will pay a price that only the United States can exact. These words were not diplomatic language, but a clear threat of war. This threat was not hanging in the air. On October 13th, NATO had launched its annual nuclear deterrence exercise, Steadfast Noon. Nuclear retaliation scenarios were being rehearsed in European skies with more than 70 aircraft, including F-35s. Moreover, Hegseth's ultimatum came in the shadow of another threat that had become increasingly concrete and dangerous in recent months. NATO's plans to invade Kaliningrad, Russia's most strategic, sensitive and nuclear-armed stronghold in Europe, within hours were the real source of fear in the Kremlin. Retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commander of US Army Europe, said that all military capacity in Kaliningrad could be completely destroyed within the first hours of an attack. Similarly, Major General Donahue, who is still in service, stated that NATO could take control of Kaliningrad at an unprecedented speed. These two statements lent deadly seriousness and weight to Hegseth's ultimatum. This was the most direct and dangerous American challenge to Russia since the Cold War. On October 15th, while these threats were being hurled in Washington, Vladimir Putin was experiencing perhaps one of the greatest humiliations of his political career in Moscow. We know that Putin sheltered former Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, who was overthrown in Damascus and forced to seek refuge in Moscow to save his life, in the Kremlin as if he were a boarder. That same Putin was forced to shake hands with Syria's new leader, Ahmed al-Sharif. These images, broadcast to the entire world, painfully demonstrated how Putin's entire influence in the Middle East had evaporated, how he had fallen from being the master of a country that was once his puppet to being a guest in Moscow, graciously received by that country's new master. Assad's overthrow already meant that Russia's decade-long investment in Syria had gone down the drain. But the new leader coming to Moscow and meeting with Putin on equal terms, as if nothing had happened, was a complete diplomatic defeat for the Kremlin. The role of deposed dictator pensioner was a black mark on his international image. Could the fact that these two events occurred within the same 24 hours be a coincidence? Of course, it was no coincidence. On the contrary, it is possible to say that the timing was extremely deliberate. This was the culmination of a systematic and coordinated operation to simultaneously dismantle the nuclear blackmail and multipolar world alliance bluff that the Kremlin relied on to continue the war in Ukraine and resist international pressure. The West had reached the end of its patience. It had seen through the bluffs, and now it was not only seeing the cards but overturning the table. This was the opening salvo of the final siege designed to bring about the end of the regime. To fully grasp the meaning of these seismic events, we must first deeply decipher the two main strategic bluffs that Vladimir Putin has persistently pursued since his decision to invade Ukraine in February 2022, and upon which he has actually built the fate of his entire regime. This war was, from the outset, much more than a conventional military operation. It was a high-stakes poker game with global consequences. And Putin's strongest cards were not his battered army on the ground, but two masterfully crafted bluffs designed to play on the West's nerves and manipulate the international system. The moment these bluffs collapsed, Putin's entire strategy was doomed to collapse. The first and most frightening bluff was nuclear blackmail. This was the card Putin relied on most, the first one he put on the table, and the most frightening and dangerous one, from the very first days of the war, perhaps even when he made the decision to start the war. His strategy was based not so much on classical military logic as on the darkest principles of psychological warfare. The goal was to keep the Western world under constant threat with its massive and modernized nuclear arsenal. With these threats, he aimed to paralyze the West, slow down its military and financial support to Ukraine, disrupt its decision-making processes and create fear and division in public opinion. The ultimate goal was to isolate Ukraine and turn the war on the ground to its advantage. This threat was particularly effective in Western capitals during the first months of the war and after the Russian army suffered an unexpected defeat on the outskirts of Kyiv. A serious atmosphere of panic prevailed. This nuclear fear, this concern about an uncontrolled escalation, was always at the heart of the long and painful debates over what weapons would be given to Ukraine, when and under what conditions. This was precisely Putin's goal: to divide the NATO alliance from within by instilling fear, to create divisions even among its strongest members, to slow down decision-making processes in bureaucratic labyrinths, and ultimately to achieve his military objectives by depriving Ukraine of Western support at a point where it could no longer cope with Russia's conventional power. This bluff was the most important psychological shield, concealing the Russian army's humiliating failures on the ground, such as its withdrawal from Kharkiv or Kherson, and buying Putin time to regroup and strengthen his defensive lines. The moment this shield was broken, Putin's strongest card would be gone, and he would be forced to face the harsh realities on the ground. The collapse of this bluff could have marked the beginning of the end for the regime. Putin's second major bluff, while not as frightening as the first, was just as vital for the regime's long-term survival and the sustainability of the war. This bluff aimed to neutralize, or even reverse, the most comprehensive and harshest economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation efforts in history, which the West had initiated in response to the war, thereby isolating the West. Its strategy was to claim that Russia was not alone against the West, but rather that Western hegemony was inevitably collapsing, and that a broad group of countries, referred to as the Global South, with extremely heterogeneous and diverse interests, were either siding with Russia or at least remaining neutral by not siding with the West. This narrative served multiple purposes. First, it sought to boost the morale of the Russian domestic public, which had been hit by sanctions and saw its standard of living decline, and to convince them to endure the hardships of war. Second, it aimed to undermine the resolve of the Western alliance and increase war fatigue among its publics. Third, and perhaps most importantly, this image of a multipolar world alliance served as a smokescreen covering the concrete mechanisms that enabled the Russian economy to circumvent Western sanctions. Parallel imports, conducted primarily through China and Kazakhstan, ensured access to critical components needed by Russian industry and the military. This bluff was the most important shield that prevented the Russian economy from collapsing completely, slowed the impact of sanctions, and still gave Putin some room for maneuver in both the economic and diplomatic spheres. However, this double bluff strategy began to lose its credibility over time and with the accumulation of facts on the ground. Western intelligence services began to see the cracks, weaknesses, and signs of panic behind the Kremlin's bluffs. Nuclear threats were repeated many times but never translated into concrete action. When HIMARS and long-range artillery systems were provided to Ukraine, Russia said, "This will dangerously escalate the war and lead to direct conflict." But the result? There was no nuclear response. Only Russian logistics were devastated. Ukraine repeatedly struck the Kerch Bridge, Putin's personal project and a symbol of Crimea's annexation. Moscow frothed with rage, bombing Ukraine's civilian infrastructure in retaliation, but nuclear weapons remained in their silos. When the decision was made to supply Ukraine with modern Western tanks, the Kremlin again threatened that the red line has been crossed, the consequences will be severe. The result? The tanks reached the front lines and began to open gaps in Russian defense lines, but no nuclear step was taken. F-16 fighter jets. When Western countries decided to supply Ukraine with F-16s and pilot training began, the Russian Foreign Ministry claimed this was an escalation into the nuclear domain. The result? Although the F-16s have not yet reached the front lines, preparations continued and there was no nuclear retaliation. When Ukraine began striking air bases, command centers, S-400 batteries, and even military and logistical targets within the Russian Federation using long-range missiles, such as Attack-MS, acquired from the US, Putin again remained silent or resorted only to conventional retaliation. The nuclear taboo was not broken again. Perhaps one of the most dangerous moments was in September 2025, when Russian drones massively violated Polish airspace. This was a direct challenge to NATO territory. However, faced with NATO's calm but determined diplomatic and military response, Moscow was forced to back down, claiming the incident was a technical error. The nuclear threat once again proved empty. The West saw through this bluff and no longer feared it. This was a turning point that fundamentally changed the strategic equation. Similarly, it became clear that the multipolar world alliance was based more on opportunism than on a solid foundation. China did not support sanctions against Russia and became an important economic lifeline by increasing trade. However, in doing so, Beijing always prioritized its own national interests, especially its enormous and indispensable trade volume with the US and the European Union. Chinese megabanks and technology companies were extremely cautious in doing business with Russia, fearing the West's secondary sanctions. When it came to military aid, Beijing always avoided crossing the red line. Moreover, Beijing strategically capitalized on Russia's weakening position in Ukraine to increase its own influence in Central Asia and establish an asymmetrical, unlimited friendship relationship that made Russia even more dependent on it for energy and raw materials. This was not an equal alliance, but was increasingly turning into a relationship of dependency dominated by Beijing. India, another BRICS partner, continued to purchase Russian oil at record discounts by not participating in Western sanctions, which became a significant source of revenue for Moscow. However, while doing so, New Delhi did not shy away from deepening its strategic partnership in the Quad Alliance in the Indo-Pacific with the US, Japan, and Australia, increasing defense industry cooperation with Western countries, and sending humanitarian aid to Ukraine. India was clearly pursuing a careful balancing act between Russia and the West, maximizing its own national interests. This contradicted Putin's narrative that India is completely on our side. The Arab world kept its distance. Most importantly, the West realized how unreliable even Putin's closest allies were and that they would abandon him at the first sign of danger. The "I am not alone" bluff was also exposed as hollow. It was empty. With both of these vital bluffs completely deciphered by the West, the strategic initiative shifted from the Kremlin to Western capitals. The period of waiting defensively was over. They had seen the fake cards in Putin's hand, and now they were preparing to put their real cards on the table with ruthless determination. The first move to checkmate the nuclear bluff came on October 13th with NATO's annual nuclear exercise, Steadfast Noon. This exercise, involving more than 70 aircraft including F-35s from 14 countries, sent a clear message to a potential adversary. In the words of NATO Secretary General Rutte, "We see your bluff, and we're putting our cards on the table too." This show of force broke Putin's nuclear monopoly. However, the real checkmate came with a much more concrete and destructive threat. This threat was the Kaliningrad execution. In response to provocations such as the September violation of Polish airspace, the West focused on Kaliningrad, Russia's most strategic and sensitive point in Europe. Retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges said that in the event of an attack on NATO, all Russian military capabilities in Kaliningrad and Crimea would be eliminated within the first hours. More importantly, active duty Major General Donahue declared that NATO would take control of Kaliningrad in an unprecedented time frame. This was a threat of invasion. Kaliningrad was a formidable arsenal, home to the Russian Baltic Fleet headquarters and nuclear-capable Iskander missiles. As Dr. Stephen Hall put it, a military base with a city in the middle. NATO's threat to wipe out this fortress within hours fundamentally undermined Putin's nuclear blackmail. The West was clearly declaring how it would rip out the bear's heart in Europe. As the nuclear bluff was shattered by the Kaliningrad threat, the multipolar world bluff was also collapsing from within. This collapse began with the betrayal of Putin's most trusted allies. The first blow came from Belarus, his closest ally. Lukashenko openly betrayed Putin by secretly meeting with Trump in September 2025 and releasing political prisoners. He was abandoning the sinking ship. The second blow came from Kazakhstan, the economic lifeline. Astana carried out logistical sabotage by starting to inspect trucks traveling from China to Russia at the borders in September-October to escape Western sanctions. A massive pileup of 7,500 trucks formed at the border. Putin's parallel import route was cut off. These internal betrayals triggered global isolation. On October 10th, the Arab summit in Moscow was cancelled due to a lack of participants because key countries such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE did not attend. Putin's narrative of the global south is with me had collapsed. As a result, on October 15th, Putin's diplomatic failure reached its final and most humiliating stage when he was forced to meet with Syria's new leader, Sharar, while hosting the ousted Assad at the Kremlin. Now that Putin had been stripped of both his bluffs, the West delivered the final psychological blow. NATO's official documents no longer defined Russia as a threat, but merely as a challenge. The concrete Kaliningrad plan proved that this was not empty talk. NATO was saying, "You are a challenge, and this is our plan for how we will respond to you." The panic this threat caused in the Kremlin was evidenced by the immediate cries of, "We will use nuclear weapons" from figures such as Leonid Slutsky. This was an admission that they could not protect Kaliningrad conventionally and that their bluff had been called. Now, on October 15th, US Defense Secretary Hegseth's ultimatum takes on its full meaning. This was the final step in the siege that had been woven thread by thread. The first and perhaps most fundamental layer of the siege was turning Putin into a legal pariah on the international stage. The arrest warrant issued against him by the International Criminal Court for war crimes committed in Ukraine had nullified his international legitimacy. More importantly, the threat of a special court that the West, particularly the European Union and the US, was trying to establish to prosecute Russia for its crimes of aggression against Ukraine directly targeted not only Putin, but also all decision-makers in the Kremlin and the generals waging the war. This legal siege restricted Putin's international movement, prevented him from engaging with world leaders on an equal footing, and made him constantly feel the threat of potential prosecution. It was an extremely effective tool that both personally humiliated him and diplomatically isolated him. He was no longer a respected leader, but a fugitive defendant with an arrest warrant hanging over him. This situation also made it increasingly risky for other countries to engage with him. The second layer of the siege was woven with a series of moves that diplomatically and economically undermined Putin's bluff that "I am not alone, the multipolar world is with me, my economy is standing strong." The most devastating of these moves came from within, with the betrayal of his own loyal allies. First, his closest and most dependent ally, Belarus, betrayed him, followed by Kazakhstan, sabotaging his economic lifeline, meaning even those he trusted most abandoned him or stabbed him in the back. This internal disintegration inevitably triggered global isolation. The humiliating fiasco of the Arab summit cancellation on October 10th destroyed Putin's image as a global southern leader and proved that he has now become a toxic figure on the international stage. Finally, the tragicomic humiliation in Syria on October 15th showed the world just how diplomatically weakened and degraded he has become, and that he is now nothing more than a regional pawn. The third and perhaps most critical layer of the siege was the neutralization of Putin's nuclear bluff, his last stronghold, his biggest trump card, and the weapon that most unsettled the West. This was achieved through a two-stage, extremely bold and risky move. Once this triple siege was complete, the stage was set for the final blow. The king is cornered on the chessboard. The game is over. Thank you for watching.